What's up, my fellow California real estate agents? I want to talk a little bit about the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement, the new BRBC. That is one of the two forms that you can use to represent a buyer and must be done prior to showing a property. So let's go ahead and jump right into the form. So the agreement starts with the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. Again, this is the form that explains to the client the difference between a seller's agent, a buyer's agent, a dual agent, and what the responsibilities of each are. You should be familiar with this form. If you're not, you definitely should read it. And jumping right into the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement, you're going to notice at the top it says, by default, it is non-exclusive unless exclusive is checked and initialed. And I am going to talk a little bit about the difference between the two, but running into the form here, this is the date you prepare the form. In this case, I decided to have my buyer be a trust. So Joe Buyer is going to buy a property and have it in his trust. So the Joe Buyer Family Trust is the buyer. And it's granting the broker, real broker here, the non-exclusive right, unless it's checked in paragraph 2A2, to represent the buyer in acquiring real property or a manufactured home for the period specified. So jumping down to the period, as a result of the NAR settlement, the agreement cannot exceed 3 months unless the buyer is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. So regular buyer or trust, it's got to be 3 months maximum. You're going to notice I did check exclusive, and I want to kind of jump into what the difference is in between a non-exclusive and exclusive agreement. So if we jump down to this section down here where it talks about compensation, non-exclusive is you're owed compensation if there was broker involvement with the property. And broker involvement is buyer physically entered and was shown the property by you. You showed the property to the buyer virtually. You submitted to the seller a signed agreement from the buyer. You performed a market analysis related to the property. And it was introduced to the buyer by the broker or one of which broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending a buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on the part of the broker, analyzing the property for the buyer, assisting the buyer in the potential acquisition of the property, and or communicating with the seller or seller's agent regarding the buyer's potential acquisition of the property. So that's what broker involvement is when we're talking about non-exclusive. Exclusive essentially means that the broker is entitled to compensation if the buyer acquires property during the period or any extension with or without the broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for the representing buyer. So an exclusive agreement is essentially they're locked into you, you're locked into them. They buy any property during that period of time, you're owed a commission. So this is a little more protective of the agent here. Jumping back up, we're going to talk about property types, and by default, it's single family residential. If you're going to be doing multifamily or one of these other property types, you're going to check a box. Location. There's an option for counties or cities, and you can have more than one. So I'm pretty broad. I'm doing my whole county here. There is an opportunity for the buyer to complete a BIPP form, which talks a little bit more about their preferences and priorities. So you can check that box and help the buyer fill that form out. If there's any properties that are going to be excluded from this agreement, so let's say they've already seen a property with another agent, non-exclusive, a month ago, and that's still on their radar, you may want to put that property here. That'll exclude it from this representation. Again, big notice, commissions are not fixed by law, and they are negotiable. All right, now the important part, the amount of compensation. So you're going to put a percentage here or a flat dollar amount here, or if you have a compensation schedule of some kind, you can attach it, but I didn't fill this out for obvious reasons, antitrust and whatnot. So you're going to put whatever you charge for your services. Now, if the broker receives compensation from the seller or others for broker's representation of the buyer, the amount's going to be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay the broker. And you cannot receive any more than what you put here. So the two big things, number one, you can't be compensated more than what's here, even if it's coming from the seller. And if you do get a payment from the seller, it's going to be credited towards that amount. So you can also write in a continuation period. So I put in 90 calendar days. So after the representation period ends, there's a 90-day period where if that buyer decides to buy a property after this agreement expires, and you were involved in showing them that property, you're basically owed a commission. So if it's a non-exclusive agreement, cancellation can be effective upon receipt or however many days you want to put. If it's exclusive, as in this case, cancellation is effective 30 days after receipt. And we can talk a little bit about cancellation. Here is the paragraph. Let's see here. Cancellation. Okay. Either buyer or broker may cancel the agreement by giving written notice at any time to the other within the time specified in paragraph 2F. Broker will be entitled to the compensation if during the representation period or the continuation, buyer acquires the property for which there was broker involvement. Okay, so keep that in mind. Jumping back up. Okay. Cancellation. Okay, so within 5 days after this agreement is executed, the buyer will provide their personal and financial information. There is a form for this. It's the BFPI. You can attach it, or you can do it within the first 5 days after coming to an agreement. And then this paragraph is extremely important. If the buyer does not have the funds to pay you, you're going to want to check this box. Or if they have a loan that doesn't allow them to pay you, you're going to check this box. So what does that mean? What is the implication of checking this box? Let me show you. Oops, sorry. Okay, so if either box is checked, buyer agrees to include a term in their offer requesting the seller to compensate the buyer's broker. So number one, they will write an offer to a seller for a property, and they will ask for the seller to compensate their agent, the buyer's agent. And it also makes it contingent upon the seller or others agreeing to pay that compensation. So the contingency is in favor of the broker, and the broker may elect to cancel the agreement related to the representation on that property. So if you make an offer on a property and your buyer doesn't have any money and the seller won't pay it, what happens? You as the buyer's agent can back out of the deal. You're going to inform the buyer that the seller and listing agent, that buyer is proceeding without representation. So you could step away and let the buyer kind of proceed on their own. And that they shall complete a new agency confirmation removing broker as representing buyer. So you can step out of the transaction. The buyer can, of course, decide not to proceed, but there are implications of working with buyers that do not have funds to pay you. Okay. There's a broker compensation advisory. We're going to go over that a little bit. Obviously, it talks about commissions not being fixed by law. So essentially, you're entitled to compensation from the buyer if they enter into agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire any property described in paragraph 2B. We already talked about what exclusive and non-exclusive is, and the continuation of the right to compensation. Essentially, compensation is going to be handled through escrow, and that's how you're going to handle this agreement. It again discusses agency and the possible dual agency. It advises the buyer not to enter into more than one agreement with more than one buyer's agent because they may end up owing compensation to two agents. Talks a little bit about what your obligations are as the broker. So you want to read up on what you're supposed to do for your buyer. Act in good faith, etc. The buyer also has to act in good faith. There's a dispute resolution section. Okay, it talks again about exclusive representation. So if it's exclusive, the buyer needs to initial here. Okay, so they're initialing here that they understand it is an exclusive agreement, and they won't enter into another agreement that conflicts with this one with another agent. Puts them on notice, as it were. Down here, you're going to once again confirm the compensation specified, and you're going to put it here if it's a percentage or a flat rate. And then because this is an entity buyer, I am checking the box. The name of the legally authorized signer is Joe Buyer, and he's buying on behalf of the Joe Buyer Family Trust dated January 10th, 2024. Be sure you fill this out if you have an entity. Otherwise, your file compliance person will ask you to do an RCSD form, and this will save you having to do that. So if you complete this correctly, you shouldn't have to do that extra form. Again, most digital signature programs will allow you to sign. You want to make sure the signature says Joe Buyer, not the Joe Buyer Family Trust. A signature that says the Joe Buyer Family Trust is not a signature because they can't sign. Only the authorized signer can, so you want to make sure Joe Buyer is signing that contract. And almost every digital signature platform allows you to accommodate that. So you just need to learn how to do it. There's the buyer investigation advisory for your client that talks about, doing all your inspections on the property. Make sure it's the one you want. There's a new broker compensation advisory that once again spells out all of the new terminology as it relates to the NAR settlement. Compensation's negotiable. There may be additional compensation that the listing agent may charge if the buyer is unrepresented. The broker might represent both buyer and seller, dual agency. Again, compensation, fully negotiable. Now this part is pretty important. This does spell it out for your buyers in case they don't understand what this is all about. But pursuant to a nationwide class action settlement reached by the National Association of Realtors, participants in multiple listing services are required to have a written agreement with a buyer prior to showing a buyer a residential property or giving a buyer a tour of such property. The agreement must identify the amount of compensation to be paid to the broker for services provided and require that the broker cannot receive any compensation in excess of the amount specified in this agreement. So it spells it out for the buyer why they have to do this now. There are options, obviously. There are several ways that the buyer's agent is going to get paid or can get paid. The buyer can pay the compensation pursuant to this agreement to their agent. The buyer can negotiate for the seller to compensate the buyer's broker. And the buyer's agent can negotiate an agreement directly with the seller if the seller is unrepresented, like a for sale by owner. So, and additionally, it spells out that there is no more compensation in the MLS service. We have the BRBC form, the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller disclosure. Again, it just explains that, there's a potential dual agency, offers aren't confidential necessarily. We have the California Consumer Privacy Act disclosure. It's another one that came out in 2022. You want to have your buyer sign this. And that is it. So that sums up the BRBC. So hopefully that's helpful. We'll talk a little bit in further videos about the RPA and how you ask the seller to give a concession towards the buyer's agent commission. but at least this will get you through filling out this form and why you need to do it. You just need to remember to do it. We'll catch you on the next video. Get out there and sell some houses. Have a great day.